following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Callie Olson. We are back. Lovin Baseball when we were 12 and innocent. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I have a very special guest today, a first-timer, Robbie Richardson. How are you, sir?
I am doing very well, Ralph. Thank you very much.
You're in South Carolina, if I'm not mistaken?
Well, I'm from South Carolina. I actually live in Michigan now, so I've been here for a while, but the rest of the family is still in South Carolina.
Whoa, you escaped to the north. Do they have about what precipitated that move?
I made the move in the late 1990s for a job, and so I moved here in 1995 and have been here now for about 27 years. So, Wow,
time flies, 27 years away from the family. And that family is, you are the son of former Major League second baseman, Yankee hero of mine, Robbie Richardson. And I want to ask you, not how old were you, but what year were you 12 years old? And I picked that number for a reason.
I was 12 years old in 1969. I was born in 1957.
So your dad was no longer playing in those days?
At 12 years old, he had already retired, yes. He retired in 1966.
He and his double play combo mate, Tony Kubek, both retired inordinately early. I think your dad was not yet 30, if I'm not mistaken. I know Tony Kubek wasn't 30. Both had physical injuries that caused them that. Do you remember at age 12 what being a baseball fan and a Yankee fan, and what was baseball to you at age 12?
At age 12, I enjoyed. I was playing at that point. That was kind of the last year of Little League before moving up into the next division. I very much enjoyed playing baseball. In South Carolina, we could play baseball 3 seasons out of the year. And so I played spring baseball, summer baseball, and often actually they had a fall league as well. So I was very much involved. Yeah.
That's terrific. Were you the oldest of the brothers?
I'm the oldest of 5 children. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters.
Okay. Was your dad a hands-on baseball guy, or did he push you, put pressure on you in any way?
No, he never did put pressure on. And it's interesting, people talk about, being the son of a major leaguer and that he would, be able to teach you baseball, and he did where he could. But he would always leave in, late February, early March for spring training. We would often go down there with him, but then we would come back to South Carolina until the school was over. And then we would go to North Jersey, rent a house in Ridgewood, New Jersey, across the George Washington Bridge from the stadium. And so in those early years, at least, he was not around to teach a lot of baseball. Now, I asked him a lot of questions when I was with him, but as far as playing and coaching, it wasn't until I was 11 or 12 that he had come back home after retiring that he did some coaching. But no, he was hands-on in the sense of very willing to go out and play catch, hit pepper, do all of those types of things. And he would come to the games when he could, when he wasn't traveling, but was never one that put pressure on any of us as kids to follow through with baseball. Nice to know.
You spent spring trainings in the Yankee camps. Did you befriend any of the other players' children at all?
And actually spring training was where that I did get to know some of the other players' children. The Yankees had an arrangement starting in 1962. They were in Fort Lauderdale. Before that, they were in St. Petersburg. And the Yankees had an arrangement with a private school in Fort Lauderdale, kind of like a one-room schoolhouse, that the Yankee kids could bring their assignments with them from wherever they lived, and the school would provide a tutor for all the different grades in one room. So they would send a van around and pick us up at the hotel we were at. They would go next door to the Galt Ocean Mile and pick up the Marist kids or, whoever else was there, and then would bring us all into the school for 3 hours in the morning, and that gave us our school days. And then at ballparks, spring training is always a little bit more informal, and so you could be around the team and on the field when they were practicing and get to know the kids that way. In New York, it was a little harder to spend time with the kids. You could be in the clubhouse up until the team went onto the field for infield, and we had to go up into the stands. And a lot of the kids that I got to know in Fort Lauderdale, the Marist kids, the Mantle kids, actually didn't come to New York. They stayed home in either Texas for the Mantles or in Missouri, Kansas City for the Marist kids back in those days. Now they would come up and visit, and I would see them, during that time. But yes, in spring training we did get to spend a good bit of time together.
Was there anyone that you befriended that you're still in touch with, just out of curiosity?
I haven't stayed in close touch. I know the Quebec kids. They were a little bit younger than I was, but I know them, and I've been in touch with Margaret, who is Tony's oldest daughter. I had a chance to reconnect a couple years ago with the Marist kids. The Yankees honored the Marist family on the 50th anniversary. Actually, I think it was the 51st before they did it, of hitting the 61 home runs. And I had a chance to go back for that, and Roger and Randy and Kevin, they were there. And so I had a chance to that. And I've gotten to know Danny and David Mantle a little bit as the years have gone on. They were younger than I was. I knew Billy, who was exactly my age, and Mickey Jr. when I was in Fort Lauderdale. But I've gotten to know Danny and David in later years.
Wow. What memories?
They really were. The other one that I was pretty close to, but unfortunately he died at an early age. And his dad also died at an early age. Was Ellie Howard Jr. Ellie would be at a lot of the ball games I was at in Yankee Stadium, and we often sat together in the family section at the stadium. So Ellie Jr. and I were pretty good friends.
I have never heard about Ellie Jr. I guess it was private. He never made the papers. Was he an athlete himself?
He was. He played college baseball at the University of Miami and was a pretty good ball player. He died pretty soon after college, and I really couldn't tell you the circumstances. I remember hearing of it and writing to Mrs. Howard, Arlene Howard, just a note of condolence that I was so sorry to hear about it. But yeah, he was a good ball player. Yeah.
I really feel. I mean, knowing about him now for the first time and hearing of his loss, I have many mixed emotions. I feel terrible. Yeah. Did he pass before his dad?
No. His dad, died in 1985, and I don't believe, I'm trying to think, I think it was soon after that Elston had died, that Ellie Jr. Now, I can't be exactly sure of that, but I believe it was afterwards. But it wouldn't have been that far apart, yeah.
Well, my condolences to the wife and any friends and family that remain. That's horrible.
When I would get back to New York, I would have a chance to see Mrs. Howard. She, at least in previous years, when I would go up to old timers games, she was often there. at other events. And then their daughter, and her first name is escaping me right now, was actually a very good musician, has sung the national anthem at Yankee Stadium, has done some stuff on Broadway, and had an opportunity of spending some time with them. Just really thought the world of the Howard family.
Okay. Listen, I picked age 12 when we were young and innocent in the title of the podcast for a purpose. When you're 12, you still have Pollyannish views of the world, yet it crosses when the intellectualism comes in and you're studying baseball as a fan, as a player. What is different? What proved to be different about baseball for you than you expected at age 12? In other words, what either did you like or dislike about how it turned out, how baseball really was?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, I've sat down with Dad a number of times and talked about the difference between today's game and the time when he played. And it was interesting. It was a number of years ago. I asked him, I said, Dad, what do you think is the biggest difference? And I expected him to say salaries or travel or, you know, a lot of things. And,
right.
And he looked at me, he said, Robbie, I think it's loyalty. He said, when I played, you played for a team. He said, I get the feeling now that a lot of these players are playing for themselves, you know, that type of a thing. I just thought it was an interesting answer. I think in the days that Dad played and that I was in my early years up till about 10 years old around the team, and then I was often back at the stadium 12, 13, 14, and then I had an opportunity again after college. Dad was involved in an organization called Baseball Chapel that did Sunday devotional services for teams, and I had a chance to speak to about probably 20 or 25 of the ball clubs at different times down through the years. So I spent a good bit of time back in the clubhouse in the 80s. And, you know, it was one of those things that I could see the change coming. That was probably about the time salaries, I guess late 70s was free agency first starting. You know, salaries were starting to take off. But I still, you know, I still think there's a family atmosphere with a lot of teams. I've had a chance, haven't in the last couple of years, but I've been back in New York with the Yankees and some others, and there really is a sense of loyalty, a sense of family that's still there. But yeah, the business side of it, I think, was something that I never really saw when I was 12 years old.
You know, I'm also very impressed with the Yankee regime of that time, that they did take care of the kids in spring training, and you were able to skip school, traditional school, and take your lessons to spring training with you.
Yeah, that was the Yankees. You know, and again, my experience down through the years, my early experience was with the players. You know, as a 10-year-old in the clubhouse, you know, one of my best friends was Big Pete Sheehy, you know, the guy that ran the clubhouse. And
yes, signed all the autographs.
Yeah, that's one of those. That's one of those well-known secrets. Yeah, it was always interesting back in those days.
Hey, Robbie, we won't tell anybody. It's just you and I.
Back in those days, there was a big picnic table in the middle of the clubhouse, and there were 12 dozen balls that were on the table every day when you came in. And so one of your responsibilities as a player was to sit down sometime during your pregame routine and sign those baseballs. And but there were certain players that no matter how early you got in, their names were already on the ball. So we won't go any further than that.
And that was Pete Sheehy. What was his child like? What was his son like?
Well, I just mentioned Pete. Big Pete was the one. He was a friend. he used to call me Butterball. Big Pete, as far as I know, didn't have children, or at least I never met him. There was, in those days,
oh, okay. It was Pete. You befriended him, literally befriended him, not his kid.
Well, I think he befriended me, and I appreciated it. He, back in those days, the two clubhouse guys were actually both named Pete. Pete Sheehy was Big Pete, and Pete Prevette was Little Pete. And they were the guys that were always there taking care of the clubhouse. They would take care of putting out the food or whatever was there. They always had a box of Bazooka bubble gum, the little squares of bubble gum. And Pete would always say, "Hey, come over here. You're gonna need some of these in the stands." And he would give me a handful to put in my pocket, or, he was always taking care of me. It was an interesting story. Back in those days, the third base coach, Frank Crosetti, who was with the Yankees forever, one of his reputations, they weren't as generous with baseballs back in those days as they are now. And Coach Crosetti was right by his locker was right by the door, and he would always look to make sure none of us were smuggling baseballs out. So I don't know how many times he stopped and patted me down. But what it was a big wad of pieces of bubble gum. He would always look to see if I was taking a baseball out.
Bazooka was a Topps baseball card affiliate.
Yes.
Bazooka gum. I wonder if you got to know my old boss with Topps. I was the Topps representative in the 80s and 90s, and I was Cyberger's employee. And I wonder if
I have met Mr. Berger. Dad, of course, knew him well. The Topps employee that I knew the best was Marty Appel. Now, he was, of course, a little bit later. He was at public relations for the Yankees before he eventually went over to Topps. But Marty had been a member of Dad's fan club back in the early 60s and always was very close. So when he came on board, right about 1969, I think, 68 or 69, when he came on with the Yankees, we would see Marty quite a bit. But I have met Mr. Berger. I had opportunities to meet the broadcasters, Mel Allen, Red Barber. When I look back, it seems 2 lifetimes ago, but the opportunities that I had during those years, I've got pictures of my brother and I with Joe DiMaggio, we come into the clubhouse, and Roger and Mickey were always so friendly. And, we just, the whole clubhouse was very friendly, very welcoming. It was a family. It really was.
Was your dad as friendly with Tony Kubek as it was set out to be? There were. I just wonder about their relationship. Double play combination.
Yep.
I think 7 years together in that capacity.
And actually a little bit more than that, because if you go back, they were the double play combination in Denver, AAA, for a couple of years before they came to New York. And so they got to be very, very good friends. They first met in probably about 1954 or 55 in Denver. And then both came up. Both of their official rookie years were 57. Dad had been up briefly in 55 and 56. Tony was Rookie of the Year in 57. That was his first time up. But yes, they were road roommates. They were good friends. And to this day, I talked to Dad last week, and he said, "Hey, I talked to Tony. Probably, I'm going to guess, every couple of weeks they touch base in one way or another, at least monthly." And they are still close friends.
Hey, this is Ralph. We're having some technical problems, but when Robbie Richardson returns, I want to play this for him. It's my imitation of the voice of the Yankees. He'll know who it is. Here it goes. Now batting for the Yankees, number 1, Robby Richardson, number 1. back with Robbie Richardson. Technology is killing us both this morning.
It is, isn't it?
We were talking about that off the air. This is the cyberspace is not for me. I'm too old for it, and you're too young for it. Robbie, how old are you now?
I will be 65 in June, so I'm getting up there. So
yeah, that puts me in my place a little bit. I'm a little bit older than you, and
I understand that.
We are both privileged to be that way, to be getting up there, because not everybody gets to enjoy it, and
that's very.
It seems to be random. Robbie, what line of work are you in now? Are you, like your dad, into the ministry?
I was for a number of years. I pastored a church in South Carolina. I worked with a nonprofit Christian ministry here in Michigan for about 14 years, pastored a church here for a while, and I've actually stepped down from all of that and am now managing a kitchen store here in West Michigan. I had a friend at church, that a younger man that had been selling kitchen things online, wanted to start a brick and mortar store and asked me if I'd help him out. And so I'm now working and selling pots and pans and cookware and enjoying it here in a store in Muskegon, Michigan.
How does your ministry teachings transcend into the business world for you?
Well, one of the things for me is that there isn't a separation between kind of a ministry world and the rest of life. One of the things that I've always tried to do, and I think it's what Dad role modeled, and it's what I firmly believe in, is to live the same way, whether it's in a church setting or it's in a business setting or it's a ballpark setting. And so for that, I think it has translated very well. Just trying to live daily, and to flesh out the reality of that faith that I have. I was very fortunate. Dad, as you may know from remembering back in those days, when Dad came to the Yankees, he was known as a person of faith. And the Yankees were always very, very accepting of that. They had a high respect for him. It was interesting. I was getting ready for coming on with you today, about some of the experiences with different Yankees. When I was 2 years old, and I don't remember specifically this happening, 1959, after a ball game, I would come down from the stands and go into the clubhouse with Dad, and was walking right in front of him. And Hank Bauer, you remember Hank, big fielder.
He played right in front of me. I was always in the right field grandstands in the first row, and Hank was number 9. This before Roger Maris.
Right, exactly.
Did you get to know my friend Joe DeMaestri at all? The late Joe DeMaestri?
No, I did. He was a reserve infielder. He was a utility fielder on the team when Dad was there. I do remember Mr. DeMaestri really well, and
I'll bet you remember him as a kind person. He was
very
he
much
and Ellie, when I think about it, and from all the people that I've interviewed, he and Ellie are two of the most, and your dad, of course, two of the most well-respected people, not for the game so much, although they were all three
athletes. Yeah.
Great. But for their personal, the way they were with people, I got to know Joe. He lived in Northern California, and was a guest on one of the shows that I did for a local cable show when I was first getting started in this. Tremendous guy. Just and I'm so impressed. You keep telling me all these things that the Yankees, they respected your dad for his religious beliefs. I wish that they were a little more racially tolerant early on.
Early in, you're right, and that they were not as slow as some of the other clubs.
Vic Power comes to mind.
Yeah.
Not that the Moose wasn't terrific, but Vic Power was the best fielding first baseman of our time, and it's a well-known story. But that was horrible. So I'm glad I'm hearing nice things about the Yankees. Did you dad ever talk about George Weiss at all?
He did, and not as much to me. There were some stories. Most of the stories about George Weiss had to do with going in to negotiate your contract. Back in those days, there were no multi-year contracts. There were no agents. And, so it was George Weiss and then later Roy Haney were the general managers. And then, of course, at the end of Dad's career, Ralph Houck stepped upstairs and was the general manager. But, he had a real high respect for those, for the management of the Yankees. And they always treated Dad well. It always amazes me. I went back and did some math a few years back, and when Dad first started playing in 55, 56, 57, the minimum salary in baseball was $5,000 a year. And at 154 games, that came out to $33 a game is what they were paying ball players back in those days. He said he made more in meal money when they were on the road than he did in his salary. So
incredible. And he and Tony, when they escaped private investigators, did go to play ping pong.
They
Am
did.
I correct?
It's a great story. They saw that they were being followed, and so they kind of ducked in and out of some place. They went into a movie theater, and the private investigators behind them bought tickets to the theater. But Dad and those didn't buy tickets. They just went in to get popcorn and then left. They ended up at a YMCA playing ping pong, and that was the report. I would have loved to have seen that report written out, when it went into the general manager.
Hey, Robbie, 2 more questions I want to ask you. I've been putting this off. Did your dad really have a contentious relationship with Casey Stengel, or did Casey Stengel have a contentious relationship with everybody, all of his players? He kept them guessing, and can you describe their relationship to me?
Yeah. Casey was good to Dad, but one of the things Dad talks about, I've heard him describe the difference between Casey and Ralph, who took over for Casey. He said the way that Casey motivated you was by trying to get you angry. He would try to goad you to get you to do your best. That was just his modus operandi. And, so you always felt you're on edge in those ways. Dad talked about in those early days, and it didn't happen to Dad as much as it did to some guys like Clete Boyer and some others, that, you'd start a game, the Yankees would get a couple runners on base early, and before your first at bat, Casey would pinch hit for you. Of course, he always had Johnny Mize or, Hank Bauer or, somebody like that sitting on the bench that he could pinch hit with. And these guys were always great hitters. So Dad has talked about, but he had a real respect for Casey. They had an opportunity to be together in the mid-'80s. The Kansas City baseball writers gave Dad an award and had him out, and they were honoring Casey at the same time. And Dad said he got a chance to sit down and spend a couple hours with Casey. And that was, he always talked about that being one of his highlights, to be able to do that. So he thought a lot of Casey, but he was always on edge. He tells the story. You'd appreciate this. There was one game that Dad started. This would have probably been in 56 or 57. And Casey pinch hit for him before Dad's first at bat. And as Dad walked back by him, he said, "Well, why'd you start me if you were going to pinch hit for me?" And Casey, come back here a minute. He said, you get a mitt and go down in the bullpen and warm up Ryan Duran. That was Dad's punishment for saying something back to him. He had to go down and warm up Ryan Duran.
And that was no small feat. I'll bet your dad wore shin guards for that one.
Shin guards and full body armor, probably. I still remember Duran going into his windup. And he came around. You probably heard this story. Hank Bauer was already in Kansas City by this time, and instead of picking up the catcher, he picked up the on-deck hitter and threw a fastball right at Hank Bauer in the on-deck. Those Coke bottle glasses were real, and he couldn't see very well.
There was the story of when Ryan Duran and Ralph Houck went at it, and I think Ralph Houck shoved the cigar right in his face.
I think it was, if I remember the story, Duran might have, Houck always had a cigar. He didn't light it that often, but he always had a cigar in his mouth. And I think Duran did something with Houck's cigar, and Houck just grabbed him by the collar. Ralph Houck, Dad always talks about that Ralph Houck was maybe the strongest and the toughest guy he ever met. And Ralph just grabbed him, and I think Duran just melted at that, because when Ralph showed that side of him, you didn't mess with him. So,
all these guys you're talking about, Hank Bauer, even Yogi, Ralph Houck, they all were war heroes. Incredible war heroes. I think Hank Bauer was at the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah. Yeah, Ralph was at the Battle of the Bulge as well. He was there. Yogi was at D-Day. Jerry Coleman is one of two ball players that flew in both World War II and the Korean War. The other was Ted Williams, who flew in both of those.
Yes, and Jerry Coleman flew in combat in both wars.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
So that's and Ted Williams went back reluctantly as an instructor, a flight instructor. Not that he wasn't a hero and all that, but Jerry Coleman was indeed a hero.
There was one of the things that the Yankees have always done extremely well down through the years is honored their former players. The Old Timers game was a part of that. Obviously Monument Park for some of the most well-known players. But one of the privileges of going back and being at those Old Timers games was the opportunity of meeting some of these people from previous years, and that's how I got to know Mr. Coleman. So
Well, Jerry Coleman malaprops. He was famous for that as an announcer in San Diego, I remember.
He is. And you look back, of course, he was an announcer with the Yankees before he went out to San Diego. But just look back at when I came along to have, Mel Allen, Red Barber, Jerry Coleman, Phil Rizzuto, Joe Garagiola was a Yankee announcer for a while.
Right.
The number of people that are there, it's amazing. So
a lot of those old games are on YouTube. You could just put Yankees on the radio, and
I've done that.
Have you done that? And,
it's fun to listen to. It really is.
Absolutely. And my favorite, remember, they had Red Barber and Mel Allen, but Phil Rizzuto made me smile and content listening on the radio as a kid more than those guys. He was real.
Yeah, he was. He was still playing when Dad first came up. Dad was actually signed as a shortstop. And when he got down to Casey Stingle's instructional school in St. Petersburg, Casey looked and said, you might better consider another position. We have Mr. Rizzuto. And that's when they moved Dad over to second base. And so they actually got a chance to play together in their early days. They were always good friends. I remember a number of times that we would fly in for an old-timers game or something, and Phil would actually meet us at the airport and pick us up and drive Dad into the stadium. Phil's son, Phil Jr., actually played baseball for Dad at the University of South Carolina when Dad was coaching there.
Whoa, didn't know that. This is tremendously informative for me.
Yeah, Phil Jr. and also Whitey Ford's oldest son, Eddie, was a very good ball player. He was a shortstop for Dad for a number of years and then was drafted AAA by the Red Sox. Drafted second round, made it all the way up to AAA ball, and then just decided that baseball life wasn't for him. But Dad, that again was part of that relationship and respect. It always meant a lot to Dad that his former teammates would send their sons down to play for him.
Well, what was the most angry you've ever seen your dad?
I'll go back to that story I started to tell you about Hank Bauer. When I was walking into the clubhouse, Hank opened a beer, apparently, and went to hand it to me. And Dad was right behind me, and Dad knocked it out of Hank's hand, knocked it across the room, and got in Hank's face and said, "Don't you ever do that again." Now, you can imagine the difference between Hank Bauer and Dad. Hank could have destroyed Dad. But Hank backed down and said, "Hey, Rich, I didn't mean anything by it." The funny part of that story, 40 years later, I was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida for Yankees fantasy camp. Hank and Moose were running the fantasy camp. And they asked me to come down because some of the older guys in the camp either didn't want to play defense or they would, they needed base runners. So they would pay my way down just to be kind of a utility player there. And at the end of the camp, I went to the Fort Lauderdale airport with Don Larson, Hank Bauer, and Moose Scourin. And
wow.
we walked into the airport at about 6 in the morning. Dad said that Hank and Moose always went 3 hours, 4 hours before their flight. And there was an old gentleman there in a Yankee hat who was sweeping up, and he looked up and he said, "You're Hank Bauer." And he looked and said, You're Moose Scourin. And he looked and said, "You're Don Larson." And he looked at me and he said, "Who the blank are you?" And Hank and Moose were like, wait a minute, he's a pastor. You can't talk to him like that. And Hank called me over. He said, "Robbie, I want to talk to you a minute." And he called me over to the side, and he said, "Robbie, are you the one that I tried to give a beer to at Yankee Stadium?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I am." He said, "Gino, I would never do anything to offend your dad. I didn't mean anything by it." I said, "Mr. Bauer."
He remembered all those years later.
He remembered 40 years later, and what a genuinely good man Hank was. I know he's a war hero. I know the gruff. I know how but boy, he had a good heart. And he and Moose were such good friends throughout the end of their years. It was fun to watch.
Robbie, did you know that Hank Bauer had an older brother who was killed in the war, who was reputedly a better ball player than Hank?
I did not know that, but that so often happened during those years.
Yeah. Hey, listen.
Going back and watching some of the old World Series, Hank was very similar to Dad in one way, in that they both were good ball players year to year, but they both turned into better ball players, I think, in the World Series. Dad, had a long record, and it still holds. It's amazing. For the smallest Yankee of all, as he used to call him, he still had the record for most hits, most runs.
Hey, does your dad, speaking of the World Series, does your dad still own the car that he won from Sport Magazine?
He drove it to South Carolina back in 1960 and traded it for a Jeep. The day after he got to South Carolina.
I'm sure he's sad about that.
No.
Hey, Robbie, we are running up against it. I thank you so much for the time you spent, and I hope from time to time you can come back and grace the microphone and maybe bring your dad with you sometime.
If you would like to do that, I would love to do it sometime. We could work that out with Dad.
Oh, that would be a thrill for me. But it will pale about the thrill I got from communicating with you and being able to tell you about Hank Bauer's brother. And you told me so many great things. And this was one of the best interviews of my life. Thank you.
No, thank you. That means a lot. It really does. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to go back and remember some great memories from those days.
That makes me feel good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Best to your dad and your entire family and the entire Yankee family. It taught me a lot about, a lot that I could respect about their memory as an organization. And I love this today. Thanks again, Robbie.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for listening, everybody. Comfortably Zone Network. I'm Ralph Tycho. Talk soon. Adios and happy trails.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.